Yeah.
So would would a religion be considered a party? I don't know.
Part of what status groups, like religious groups, are status groups, right? And they can influence political parties.
Okay.
Yeah. Because you have, for example, many organizations, actual parties, in Weber's terminology, organizations like, what are some of the religious conservative organizations? American Family. What are some of the main organizations? I can't come up with the names right now.
Evangelical or something.
Yeah, some of the evangelical organizations. Focus on the Family, for example. Yeah, Focus on the Family is an organization, a formal organization. It has certain rational rules and laws that determine membership, that determine its policies, its mission. That has a professional staff which formulates those policies and informs its membership, and they're trying to influence political parties in order to achieve decisions that they want to see in society, in order to limit abortion, for example. So they influence. So based on those status interests, based on religion, they're trying to influence the political party system. But of course, labor unions, for example, would be considered a class-based organization because they're representing working class interests of those who work for a wage. So it's a real mix that you see. Now the really interesting part about Weber's discussion of parties, unfortunately not in the text that you read. It would continue on if they had offered a larger excerpt, because Weber argues that even though political parties or any organization, any formal organization is originally set up to serve certain interests, to represent its constituents' interests. So political parties are set up to represent certain interests. If they're based on class or status, doesn't matter. But over time, organizations very often acquire a life of their own, meaning that they perpetuate themselves in order simply to perpetuate themselves, to remain in existence, and become somewhat cut loose from the original purpose. A German sociologist called Michels, Robert Michels, in 1911 wrote about this issue, and he called it the iron law of oligarchy. And he said that no matter how democratic an organization is originally when it is set up in order to represent all its members' interests in a democratic fashion. No matter how democratic an organization is in the beginning, over time, organizations will evolve towards an oligarchy in which just a low number of leaders determine its policies. Iron law of oligarchy. Oligarchy means the rule of a few. Okay, so that's the opposite of a democracy where all rule, the people rule. Oligarchy is a system in which a few rule. Iron law, because he says this is simply what happens to any organization. Michels described that as the great tragedy, actually, of mass democracy based on mass political parties that are held to represent interests, but in a very complex modern society. That over time, what happens is that there's a real distancing between the purpose that these organizations or parties were originally set up for, and what they simply have to do in order to perpetuate themselves, in order to remain in power, in order to maintain influence. And Weber had a quite similar view to this, because first of all he says that parties, the very existence of parties, is characteristic for modern society. In other words, it's characteristic for societies which are based on the operation of bureaucracies, which we have already discussed in class. By the time you see this, we already have discussed in class the three different forms of legitimate authority: rational authority, charismatic authority, and rational legal authority. So parties really belong into the world of rational legal authority. Weber, as you know, was also very worried about the form of democracy that he saw emerging. When you have actually a mass democracy, what evolves is a system of experts who have two in a small group make very complex decisions based on technical criteria, where there cannot almost be constant feedback, a constant contact between the masses of people and the party or the bureaucratic apparatus, because ultimately it's the bureaucratic apparatus, which is not even exchanged. You know, when we have elections, we don't really exchange the bureaucratic apparatus. So Weber was very worried about, over time, the extreme power in a democracy that bureaucrats would hold over society. Yeah? So for him, democracy was really a rather limited, in its true sense of the word, where you say the people rule, that's what democracy means. Weber saw that that definition is not really adequate for a modern bureaucracy.
I was wondering, so Mike Michels was saying that organizations, the interest to perpetuate themselves sometimes then become, and then they become in conflict with like the original goals.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Does he talk about like any sort of safety mechanisms or something like that? Or like,
no, he was. I mean, he was the first one to point out the dangers of it. He didn't himself come up with any mechanisms to prevent it, but after his work is then the basis for trying to come up with mechanisms. For example, you could say that in those states in the United States where you have referenda, offering a referendum is one way to limit the power of the oligarchy, because a referendum on one specific question where it means a decision is taken on a specific issue by the whole electorate, rather than you just voting for your representative and then the representatives with the bureaucratic apparatus taking the decision. So it's one small way in which the power of bureaucrats is limited in the US, but it's rather limited.
And it's just about the meritocracy. So Jung would think that status is like a stabilizing force.
Yes.
And, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Because it makes it acceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah, which has caused quite a bit of a stir when that book came out, because the assumption is always that meritocracy is really what we want to work towards. That would be the best type of society. But interestingly, it destroys social peace, simply because it makes it more obvious. It seems, at least how he imagines it, but it's entirely plausible for how he describes it, that this is indeed what it would be like. That if you have to reckon with your position as being the consequence of your own inferiority, that's pretty hard to take. So that system, of course, is good for those who are very intelligent, very clever, and know how to make use of their cleverness, but it's unbearable for those who are not. So yes, status contributes to social stability. Okay, anything more? Okay. Thank you.